Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and we're going to pick right back up where we last left off. In our last lecture, we were discussing Herbert Hoover and his actions during the early stages of the Great Depression, and as the stock market crash was occurring. Now, Hoover was an activist. It really, the historical record doesn't really present it, but he really was an activist president during the stock market crash and the early stages of the Depression. And there were a number of reasons why he embarked on this activist presidency during the economic collapse. One, he was genuinely a humanitarian. He was, after all, the person who led the charge against hunger in Europe after World War I. And it really was not within his character to sit by idly and meekly while the American population went hungry during his administration. Hoover was also a progressive, and as such, he ascribed to this philosophy that government should not be inactive. Moreover, more people no longer believed at that time that government should do nothing when the economy or business was in turmoil. People also did not believe that an economic depression was normal. Previous generations have believed in the whole cycle, the boom and the bust, but by now people were beginning to think that this was abnormal and that it should not happen within business. And equally important to all of this was doing nothing was just not a viable option as it could lead to revolution. Ever since the Russian Revolution, there have been nothing but revolutions throughout the industrialized world. The Bolsheviks came to power and inaugurated the Soviet era in Russia. Just before peace was meted out at Versailles, there was a revolution in Germany in which all of the German monarchies were swept away. And even now, in the late 20s, early 30s, more political upheavals were taking place in Europe. Francisco Franco established himself as a fascist dictator in Spain. Mussolini was rising in Italy. He was establishing fascism in Italy, and fascism was becoming very prominent, very popular in Germany. Had the Nazi Party rose to become the dominant party in Germany, and you can trace the Nazi Party's rise to the dire economic straits, the economic woes that Germany faced. So being inactive was not an option. It would lead to revolution, or at the very least, radical political upheaval. Now, Hoover did come up with an economic recovery plan. This plan reflected his values, his conservative values, especially his belief in the associational society, as well as a reliance on voluntary groups for rational scientific planning. The government's role in stimulating such groups, but not to dictate to them. And Hoover set about holding a series of meetings with the business and labor leaders to keep production going, along with keeping wages up. He used the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1929 to promote agricultural cooperatives and to stabilize corporations that limited production. Hoover also agreed to a modest public works program to provide jobs to the unemployed. Hoover also backed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which sought to encourage agriculture in overseas market and industries at home. Hoover also encouraged the state and local encouraged works at the state and the local level. The public works were coupled with the 1932 Emergency Relief and Construction Acts, which Hoover also sort of parlayed his influence into supporting loans to endangered financial institutions. Basically, that portion of his economic recovery plan entailed using sound banks to support banks in trouble. Now, these programs did not end the Depression. Under these programs, the Depression only worsened, and the failure of its programs really motivated Hoover to go even further and to address the frozen global assets and the Glass-Steagall Act of 1932, which allowed for commercial paper to be collected as collateral for federal loans and notes. Also for the release of gold and thus the expansion of the money supply. Now, the Federal Home Loan Act allowed that gold and other home mortgage papers be accepted as securities for new home loans. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation provided government funds to businesses and large corporations. Now, Congress initially made $500 million available to the corporations, but it authorized loans of up to $1.5 billion. Now, this marks all of Hoover's efforts to sort of stem the economic woes. This marks a dramatic shift from his previous stance and a preferment for volunteerism, from volunteerism to direct government action, direct government intervention. All of what Hoover did was unprecedented in United States history. New Dealers were quick to know most of the New Deal's programs were really exacted or extracted from Hoover's programs. And so that begs the question, at least to some people, why does Hoover have such a low reputation as a do-nothing president? And Hoover's reputation really suffers because he lost his election. He lost the campaign against Franklin Roosevelt, and it was because the New Deal went way much further than Hoover's own conservative measures. When you compare them, Hoover's measures look really weak and infantile in comparison to the bold and daring measures that the New Deal put up there, that Franklin Roosevelt threw up with the New Deal. Future events also distorted the understanding of what Hoover did during his presidency. Hoover's attacks on Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal led to a wider condemnation of him and his presidency. Hoover's bad reputation is also impacted by his office and his behavior, his actions and his behavior while in office. When the market crashed in 1919, he lost his halo and immediately became a public pariah. In good times, he came across as a deeply respected efficiency expert, but in bad times, he came across as very cold and distant. He lacked, I said it before in a previous lecture, he lacked all the personal charm that Warren Harding had and that Franklin Roosevelt had. He could not easily warm others to his opinions and to his side. Hoover it's also important to note that Hoover was not a professional politician. Harding, Coolidge, Roosevelt, they were all professional politicians. Hoover had never held an elected office before 1928. He was a capable administrator, but all of his positions had been appointive. He was an executive, a very powerful mining executive. He had been appointed to oversee famine relief. He had been appointed to the position of Secretary of Commerce. He had never won an election. He had never won. He never had to compete on the public stage before 1912. And in 1928, his opponent, Al Smith, was handicapped. Al Smith was, 1, a Democrat. He was 2, a wet, and 3, he was a Roman Catholic. Al Smith lost. He lost the Deep South by being a Catholic, and he alienated a lot of people by being a wet. So even with that election in 1928, it's not really a very fair comparison to say that he's a winner in all this. Had he ran against someone who wasn't as socially disadvantaged as Al Smith, it's he probably still would have won, but it would have jarred him a bit more. He was really politically unprepared for his assumption of federal office. Hoover also he also, throughout his career, he developed a knack for citing statistics. He was an efficiency expert. He wanted to cite statistics. He wanted to work with the numbers. He wanted to crunch numbers. And that is fine when things are going great. It's great to show and point to these statistics while things are going good. But during a depression or an economic panic, that's a bad thing to do. People generally want immediate aid. They don't want to be shown the numbers. Hoover also became disliked for making these overly optimistic statements that were really at odds with reality. He believed that the economic system was sound, but that investors had just lost faith. He thought that by continually making optimistic statements, investor confidence will return and everything will be righted almost immediately. He was perceived as a fool lost in his own world by his contemporaries for that outlook. Hoover was not alone really in believing that the system was sound. A number of major industrialists and major economic figures felt that way. Henry Ford went on the record and called the crash a speculator's panic. Ford, like Hoover, thought that the key to economic recovery was keeping up production and business leadership. It should also be noted that Henry Ford that he told his workers not to rely on employers and to look for their own work and to, most importantly, cultivate a plot of land, which sort of echoes Henry Ford's own beliefs and what he said, but also it's very good advice given the grave situation that the Republic was facing. So interesting, but sound advice from one of the great industrialists to his employees. It is also important to note that Hoover believed in clear boundaries between government and business. He had this very deep-rooted fear of the consequences of government dictating to business. That is why at first he opted for voluntarism, but quickly learned that system was not so sound and that any agreement could not really be kept between business leaders and government. Also, some of his measures, such as the Smoot-Hawley tariff, only really served to make things worse by hurting international trade. And really, that was all really linked to Hoover's fears of government regulation, government regulating the businesses. He refused to release government funds to help that situation. He labeled it a dole that would destroy the American system and individual initiative. Hoover vetoed the Garner-Wagner relief bill and insisted that the states must provide money to do so, and that the federal government should not help in this situation. Through it all of this, Hoover comes to be seen as either blind to reality or just inhuman. But by sticking to these old sort of Democratic Republican, Madisonian, John Taylor Caroline type of ideology on the role of government, he sort of falls very short in that department. Had the presidential leader had the major leader. Now, when speaking of Hoover's voluntary association model, it really sort of looks like the contemporary trickle-down economic theory. What he did was he authorized loans to banks and big businesses, and this taken up with his vetoes makes him appear to be willing to let the people starve while saving the banks. Now, Hoover's thinking was that by giving the money, making the money available to banks and corporations, the banks and corporations would then funnel that money on to their employees, that they would use this money to, one, increase production, but two, hire on more workers so that that money would make it to the hands of those who needed it the most. That didn't happen, and Hoover's reputation suffered. He suffers. Has been a friend only to big business and not really caring about what happened to everybody else. Now, Hoover also objected to going further to help business based on his fears of government intrusion. He has noted many times in this lecture, he had these great fears about what would happen if the government intruded too much into the lives of the citizens in regard to business, to their business practices. Hoover in these fears, he rejected corporate requests to form cartel agreements. As a matter of fact, Hoover went so far as to authorize. He went so far as to authorize the Justice Department to pursue antitrust prosecution against corporations who tried to form cartel agreements, and this largely alienated him from his business support base, and that was his main support base: the fact that he had the full confidence and backing of business leaders. That just alienated him from a large portion of those men. Hoover also in 1932 offset his pro-recovery legislation by increasing taxes in an effort to balance the budget. And he refused to get off the gold standard. And he insisted on international currency stabilization. Hoover also became more rigid and hardened ideologically. And this is all reflected in his continued support for Prohibition, which really by 1930, 1929 had clearly failed. But before he became president, it was an open secret that Prohibition had failed. By the end of his presidency, it was just a stamped on fact that Prohibition had failed. A greater example of his rigidity was his reaction to the Bonus Army. And now the Bonus Army would comprise the World War I veterans who had organized themselves as the BEF, the Bonus Expeditionary Force. And that was a play on the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, and that was the title given to the force that was sent to Europe back in 1917. Now, the BEF, the Bonus Expeditionary Force, they marched on Washington, D.C., and they camped out on Capitol Hill to demand the bonus money promised to them be paid early. When the Senate refused, most accepted the offer of a free ticket home. 2,000 of them, however, remained encamped at Anacostia, and that was the site of a conflict. With a confrontation simply looming over them, Hoover, on the recommendation of Secretary of War Patrick Hurley, sent in the Army on July 28th. Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur, with his then aides Dwight Eisenhower, sent George Patton, with his then aides George Patton and Dwight Eisenhower attacked. They attacked these encamped veterans along with their families using 1,000 ground troops equipped with tear gas, machine guns, and tanks. In a scene that was really reminiscent of the Ludlow massacre that we discussed earlier during our discussions about industrialized labor. And to make matters worse, Hoover and Hooley then attacked the Bonus Army's marchers as subversives, has people who were anarchists, who were coming about to undermine the American system, the American way of doing things. Our understanding of Hoover is really complicated. And it's really complicated by the failures of his programs and the political attacks of his enemies. They're also complicated by his attacks on later government measures that went above and beyond his own measures. And equally important is Hoover's own behavior, his ideological rigidity, that made him appear as cold and uncaring for the plight of the people. Though he was highly intelligent, he was not a politician, and he could not reverse the tide that had turned against him. And with that being said, we'll break here. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. Let me know what you thought about Herbert Hoover. Hoover remains a very polarizing figure. One thinks back to the old television sitcom All in the Family. They had that very unique and interesting line, "Mr. We could use a man like Herbert Hoover again." Always made me think, why Herbert Hoover? But if you watch the show and you sort of see Archie Bunker's temperament, then you sort of understand why he would support him. But as always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about the lecture, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.